Belonging First Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Essentials course for the mining industry. Module 4 Creating Belonging at Your Workplace for the Mining Industry. Presented by Andrea Carter in support of Women in Mining Canada's initiative to educate, elevate, and empower. Please note that this module is approximately 25 minutes in length. In the Creating Belonging at Your Workplace, Module 4, in this series, we'll be covering the following learning outcomes. We'll review diversity as it currently applies to hiring predictors commonly used in employee selection and assessment. We'll explore the importance of data collection to make the transition from assumption based decisions into data driven decisions. And finally, I'll share the Belonging First zones to help you identify the data to collect to be more prepared and also create a Belonging First culture. This will prepare you for Module 5, where I'll cover predictive governance methods for both short term and long term strategies. From our most recently collected survey data, the top challenges boards, executive leadership, HR, and committees are faced with are communication, which specifically means what organizations are communicating, how they're communicating it, and the frequency of those communications. Context and language, which is huge right now because most organizations and their people are not sure what most of the terminology means, how to properly apply it, and how to define the values and vision everyone at the organization will use so that everyone is talking about the same thing. What I mean by this is at present, we have a lot of organizations that when you use a simple word like diversity, for example, and you have four people in a room together, all four people will have different definitions and context of the word's meaning. The lack of context and language that's then incorporated into training or lack thereof therefore leaves grounds for miscommunications and defensive responses. With this comes hostility and defensive patterning that leads to CSR, EDI, and ESG meetings, policies, and procedures that stay in an immovable zone and halts progress. In turn, that leads to inconsistency with strategy and implementation, often training and policies that are then only available to certain levels within the organization. And then governance and reporting ends up lacking the right context, content, as well as data to sustain both lasting long and short term goals. Post pandemic, human capital became top of mind because of the direct correlation between an employee's knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics and engagement as it pertains to organizational performance and growth strategy. Golden 2019 refers to human capital as the stock of skills that the labor force possesses. Now, while leaders have looked at the importance of AI and technology for growth, many have failed to understand the importance of human capital. That is, until the pandemic hit and the way in which organizations work dramatically changed. The pandemic also unequivocally revealed that skills and knowledge are not solely tied to formal education, but more importantly, tied to resilience, determination, and capability, all components that actually evolve from key belonging indicators. Mistakenly, many leaders underestimated the factors that allow humans to be resilient, determined, and capable, which is what we've been talking about in this series, including the importance of belonging within your organization and workplace. The health of an organization is ultimately defined by its alignment with the larger environment, as well as how appropriate its subsystems align with its overall purpose and then how efficient the subsystems can interact so that they continue to acquire and convert inputs into useful outputs. While talent and selection have long used ability and personality predictors for recruiting and selection, diversity metrics, along with race and cultural differences in predictors that are commonly used in employee selection and assessment, have not evolved to the level that they are needed for today's operational levels. Little work until recently has been devoted to systematically summarizing the emerging literature and applicable integrations on score differences between different cultural groups, a factor that played into this Belonging First research study. Current research finds that mean score differences for immigrant and non immigrant groups within any given country can, for example, be as large as those typically observed between white and Black Americans in the US. Tay Naginwis and Van der Flyer 2020. Given the increasing trends in globalization and immigration, as well as our truth and reconciliation acknowledgments, exploring these differences as they pertain to the talent pipeline and culture within an organization is important for both science and practice. For that reason, refer back to the definition of diversity blindness presented to you in previous models and the corresponding white paper, as well as the importance of understanding intersectionality. At the heart of diversity blindness definition is the calling to understand language, context, bias, and collective intentions of your organization. If the intention is to create a belonging first culture at your workplace so that your organization benefits from its joint corporate social responsibility and ESG initiatives, which jointly should be encompassing equity, diversity, and inclusion, it's important to remember that in the lottery of life, there are specific things that people do not have control over. You do not have control over your race or ethnic identity. You do not have control over your gender identity. You do not control your sexual orientation. You do not control mental illness. You do not control your physical appearance or genetic makeup. And you do not control visible or invisible disabilities. However, what you do control is how you treat people who are different from you, which means that to effectively create a belonging first culture at your workplace, awareness, data, learning, and governance are crucial. For that reason, we'll cover the three different belonging first zones, or stages if you'd prefer, of cultural competence and equity, diversity, and inclusion awareness, and their observable and measurable components that lead to belonging first workplaces. The three different belonging first zones observed within the organizational environment are belonging first diversity blindness zone, belonging first recognition zone, and belonging first growth zone. Before I cover these zones and what it takes to create belonging at your workplace, it's important to acknowledge that there absolutely is no Amazon Prime that's going to deliver a belonging first culture or effective EDI strategy to you overnight. I say that to help manage expectations and help you focus on both your short and long term goals so that you begin to celebrate momentum over completion. Each organization needs to be able to assess their current climate and identify specific short and long term goals, strategies, and policies that will help them evolve from each zone to the next. There simply is no carbon copy template for equity, diversity, and inclusion. And what you adopt is entirely dependent on your organization and all of its subgroupings as they exist right now. That said, your commitment and dedication to equity, diversity, and inclusion is as important as the strategies you create. Lemonine's 2020 contends that an organization that appears to have an inappropriate structure and strategy for the context of its environment might still be able to operate efficiently simply because they've adopted coping strategies to deal with the context. However, when transparency and talent ta- um, are tight, underlying conflict, bias, and oppressive structures that exist will be revealed. So please keep that in mind as I walk you through the high level elements of each of these belonging first zones. Within each of these zones, you'll find a collective intention, beliefs, values, and priorities. The goal is to evolve from the diversity blindness zone into the recognition zone and then into the growth zone. The key is to moving from one zone to the next is entirely dependent on your context, priority, and a focus on progress. If a checklist is all you're after, belonging first cultural benefits will not be achieved. When equity, diversity, and inclusion through a belonging first cultural lens is strategized as a continuous journey, where the benefits from the work and commitment are the goal, competitive advantage, growth, innovation, and increased performance are the result. So let's explore the three zones of cultural competence and EDI awareness now through the belonging first zones, keeping in mind that regardless of where your organization is, your goal is merely to acknowledge it and then start strategizing based on what zone you're in. Within the diversity blindness zone, homogeneity is where you'll see both superficial and deep level diversity absent. The external presence is notable based on superficial appearance of both the directors and executive leadership, as well as within the level of people managers. Tokenism is present. So when organizations are in the diversity blindness zone, they struggle to retain diverse talent because the cultural and climate isn't conducive to differences. From a neuropsychology and neuroscience perspective, people tend to gravitate to those who look and act like them, which aligns with the basis of superficial diversity. This happens simply because the cycles of socialization have reinforced this behavior and the tendency. This happens across all races, ethnicities, and socioeconomic status. The brain has pathways that are like superhighways. So biases operate through systems and experiences that are comfortable. Affinity bias, perception bias, confirmation bias, and even the halo effect continue because the brain searches for patterns and context that it knows. And when it doesn't have the appropriate context, it challenges the speed of the existing superhighway. Challenging these biases are like putting a cart and buggy in the path of a Ferrari on a major highway, but they're important to understand and have systems and policies in place to shift this so that the superhighway is built to accept differences and meaningful belonging first contexts. To change tokenism and homogeneity within organizations, it starts with self awareness of our own social identity and cultural influences and how they intersect with those who are leading the change management. Which brings us to the next point: a lack of equity, diversity, and inclusion programs, policies, metrics, and data. Before you can understand and value differences, you must be able to measure the variance that exists. And most organizations in the diversity blindness zone are using old, dated employment engagement surveys that do not account for demographic differences. What happens is then that the data collected is based on majority analysis. And if the majority of the workplace is homogeneous, the decisions will be based on assumptions, and the biased and systemically oppressive collective intentions are then able to be upheld. We see this often within organizations that have high employee silence, groupthink, and low connection measures. Data driven decisions, governance, tracking, and measurement are now the most imperative methods for belonging based EDI decision making. Without validated and reliable data, assumption based and bias based decisions that lack the appropriate context for change will continue. That's why in the diversity blindness zone, we see assumption based decisions as the primary decision that are being made. So, assumption based decisions are apparent with what is being implemented, how it's being implemented, as well as the equity diversity strategies, pillars, goals, priorities that are selected by leadership. To move away from assumption based equity, diversity, and inclusion decisions, two awarenesses are mandatory. First, the awareness on the societal inequities and systemic oppressive behaviors and barriers, which include their roles in cultural competency. And secondly, the collection of valid and reliable data. Data is what helps organizations move away from assumption based decisions, providing measurable and trackable foundations that will be integrated and embedded into business policies, procedures, and strategy. I want to also provide some foundational examples of what data is required because many are simply unaware of what they should be measuring for progress. And old engagement surveys are not the answer, especially because they're not being analyzed in a meaningful way. There are three specific belonging based data tools that I recommend. The first is a comprehensive equity, diversity, and inclusion assessment tool that will measure your HR strategy and operations, organizational culture, sourcing, recruitment, and talent selection practices, performance metrics, learning and development practices, offboarding, and alumni data. This assessment should be created as a survey tool that all executive leaders, HR, and potentially even your EDI committee participants or even your board will participate in. The importance of this step is twofold. First, as it acts as an intervention because it showcases many of the aspects that those who are not involved in policy, strategy, program development need to be aware of. And secondly, it measures what elements will become your short versus your long term strategy, as well as the pillars and governance you'll move forward with, including the contextual terminology your organization will use moving forward. Second is a validated belonging survey that measures demographic data, workplace comfort, workplace contribution, workplace connection, workplace psychological safety and trust, workplace well being, workplace perception and engagement with equity, diversity, and inclusion. So, this is the basis of the research that we have done within the mining industry. However, people can create their own surveys. The most important piece is that the survey needs to be validated. So that's what we've achieved first and foremost through the initial research. When you have a validated survey, you're able to measure the 7 critical indicators that provide organizations with usable metrics to understand how employees feel at their workplace. The data is essential because when analyzed appropriately, where you're able to take the demographic data, you're then able to understand the minority versus majority groupings that are visible and contrastable. This provides organizations an awareness of how belonging is experienced within the organization, how much groupthink and employee silence exists, and how inclusive as well as superficial and deep level diversity concepts are accepted. The third belonging first space data tool is to examine specific governance models, committees, and defined contexts for equity, diversity, and inclusion. In the spirit of time where there's a lot more information to share on this, governance models, committees, and defined contexts should all begin with clear equity, diversity, and inclusion vision, mission, values, and purpose. Most importantly, clear contextual meaning, language, and terminology outlined as appropriate per organization is essential. Without clear context, each person will continue to think of EDI through their own biased lens and progress through um, stages that aren't necessarily defined by the entire organization. And that's where progress inevitably stalls. We'll cover more of this in Module 5. Back to the diversity blindness zone. So, in this zone, you'll likely see that there is a lack of governance, perhaps committees that you'll see comprised of people who are, they're interested in equity, diversity, inclusion, but they don't have formal equity, diversity, and inclusion education, training, or skill. They also often lack clearly defined context and terminology, and they're learning as they go. So, an example of this is where you see statements about equity, diversity, and inclusion that are long, drawn out commitment statements with high level words that lack meaning, context, and how they'll actually be achieved. In the diversity blindness zone, when you ask a leader or even a people manager about EDI policies, procedures, and strategy, or what those mean to them, they're often unable to use simple, plain, clear language, and they'll struggle with the terminology itself. So that means that the EDI ownership is with HR or the committee of untrained but interested employees. So when that happens, compliance focused equity, diversity, and inclusion communications and PR are often used because there's a lack of ownership for the actual equity, diversity, and inclusion strategy. In this context, equity, diversity, and inclusion terminology is complex, it lacks context, and it's often unactioned. This then leads to non-participation, groupthink, employee silence, defensive-based climate, as well as culture. In the recognition zone, this is where you'll start to have, while you still have homogeneity and tokenism, your awareness and your strategy for change is recognized. So that's the big piece. You recognize that that's what you have. And this is where leaders will begin to understand that they also need to acknowledge their own part in that cultural competency and how they communicate and then model the importance of EDI. When a leader is truly bought into EDI, you'll see this going from the workplace into the home life. And when this happens, there's a notable commitment to understanding systemic barriers, which start with data-based steps and integrate methods for awareness. This unveiling leads to the appropriate gap analysis. Now, gap analysis and data acquiring actions such as EDI leadership assessments, organization wide surveys, focus groups, hiring experienced EDI and social justice trained industrial and organizational psychologists, or experts and consultants who are aware of the most up to date within the past year, 2 years max consultants. You'll start to see short term EDI missions, programs, policies, metrics, and data. And these are the elements that begin being defined. You'll also start seeing long term EDI vision, policies, procedures, and governance that are being strategized based on the data and specifically the organizational needs of your company. You start to see that assumption based decisions fall away and the reliance on validated data become the norm. That's a really big piece of this. When that starts to happen, the equity, diversity, and inclusion ownership begins to align not only with just the HR and the committee, but with the board as well as other leaders within the organization. Within this stage, you'll also start to see that the forming of equity, diversity, and inclusion committees start to recognize that there's a difference between initiatives and governance models. And those governance models start to move forward based on the validated data sets. So they start measuring the initiatives, they start measuring what the long and short term elements are, so that it actually starts to provide meaning and substance for the organization. And that organization wide meaning and its considerations and communications is really important because it then begins the actual training and development across all levels of the organizations, and you start to see champions emerge. Once organizations begin taking action from the belonging recognition zone, if commitment and dedication is normalized, they then enter the growth zone. The belonging first growth zone. So, this is where heterogeneity begins to appear, both from a superficial and deep level diversity lens. Now, it should be noted that some organizations will have arrived at heterogeneity through a checklist. However, if that's the case, this is also unfortunately where conflict will begin to arise and challenges to the underlying policies and values of the organization start to show up. From a best practices perspective, this is when intentionality really shines through and belonging first cultures pull away from those who are just following the checklist. If the collective intention has a commitment to removing systemic barriers, employee engagement, innovation, and creativity, all of that starts to increase and soar, and the company exceeds performance and noticeable growth is measured. Employee centered models, strategies, initiatives, and governance are generated from the data driven metrics because the hard work has gone into collecting the actual data and understanding what your employees are thinking, feeling, and experiencing. This means that your equity, diversity, and inclusion gaps have both short and long term prioritized goals that are monitored and assessed, as well as clearly outlined on public records. Your employees know what equity, diversity, and inclusion means to your organization, and they understand the terminology as well as become the champions for moving it forward. EDI ownership is then recognized as an organizational wide element, and organizational equity, diversity, and inclusion committees and governance models are established with clear pillars, initiatives, metrics, roles, policies, and procedures that are visible and transparent to all. Belonging first behavior is modeled with both the board and leaders, as well as with the people managers and employees, as well as the organizational wide collective belonging first equity, diversity, and inclusion intentions, meaningful actions, communications, and governance. They're all known, felt, and celebrated. Now, while each of these belonging zones have multiple complex steps, they do provide internal and external alignment of the organization with its larger environment. Going from a diversity blind and avoidance structure into recognition and growth structures is a process. However, with short and long term goals, the actions involved are what create real belonging at your workplace. In Module 5, we'll take the next step with exploring how to take belonging first metrics into an organizational growth strategy. I'll see you there.